My parents paid for my sister's entire wedding.
$62,000.
When I got engaged 2 years later, they told me weddings were a waste of money and offered me $800. Tonight every single story is about a parent who had a favorite child. Not subtly, not something you had to read between the lines to see. Obviously, consistently, for years. And what happened when each of these people finally said something about it? 5 families, 5 favorites, 5 moments when everything finally came out into the open. This is the part that gets me every time. Let me take you back to where each of these stories started. My name is Rachel. I am 32 years old. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. And 8 months ago I sat across from my parents at their kitchen table and asked them directly why they had paid $60,000 for my younger sister's wedding 2 years earlier and had offered me $800 toward mine, which I was planning at the time. My sister's name is Emily. She is 29, and she got married 3 years ago in a wedding that I want to describe in detail because the contrast matters to understanding what happened at my parents' kitchen table. Emily's wedding had 140 guests at a vineyard venue 2 hours from our hometown. It had a live band, a photo booth, a videographer, a custom dessert table in addition to the wedding cake, and a rehearsal dinner the night before that my parents also paid for entirely, at a restaurant that required a deposit larger than what they eventually offered me for my entire wedding. I had helped plan pieces of Emily's wedding. I had been in the wedding party. I had watched my parents spend, over the 18 months of planning, what I now understand to have been approximately $60,000 without ever once discussing budget constraints or hesitation. When I got engaged 2 years later, I sat down with my parents to discuss wedding planning the way Emily and I had discussed it together during her engagement. My mother told me that weddings were, in her words, largely a waste of money, and that she and my father had been thinking that a smaller, more meaningful ceremony would be more appropriate for me. Someone she described as always having been more practical than Emily. She offered $800, which she framed as a generous contribution toward whatever modest celebration I chose to have. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think the specific feeling matters to understanding why I eventually confronted them. I did not feel angry immediately. I felt confused, in the specific way you feel when information does not match a pattern you believed you understood. I had grown up believing my parents loved Emily and me equally, in the general diffuse way children believe things about their parents without examining them closely. The $800 offer, set against the memory of $60,000 spent without hesitation 2 years earlier, was the first moment I allowed myself to examine the pattern rather than simply live inside it. I spent several months examining it. Once I had started, I want to list some of what I found, because listing it is how I finally understood the scope of what I had been living inside without naming it. Emily's college tuition had been paid in full by my parents. I had taken out loans for mine, which they had told me, at the time, was because they believed the loans would teach me financial responsibility. Emily had lived at home rent-free until she was 26 while working an entry-level job. When I had asked to do the same at 24, I had been told that I needed to learn independence. Emily's car, a nearly new sedan, had been a graduation gift. Mine had been a used vehicle I purchased myself with the loan money I had been encouraged to take out for responsibility building purposes. Every individual instance, across years, had come with an explanation that made sense on its own terms. Collected together, across 2 decades, the pattern was not subtle. I sat my parents down 8 months ago and I asked them directly why they had paid $60,000 for Emily's wedding and offered me $800 for mine. I asked the question factually, without the specific list of every other instance I had cataloged, because I wanted to see how they would respond to the single clearest example before I brought forward the pattern. My mother's first response was that Emily's wedding had simply grown organically, and that they had not set out to spend that much. I asked whether the growth had ever been discussed or questioned at any point across 18 months of planning. She acknowledged it had not. I asked why my wedding, by contrast, had been met with an immediate ceiling before any planning had even begun. My father, at this point, said I was being dramatic and that comparing myself to my sister was not productive, and that every child's circumstances were different. I told him I was not comparing myself to Emily. I was comparing how they had treated the same category of major life event for two different children, and asking for an explanation of the disparity. Neither of them had one. My mother eventually said, quietly, that Emily had always needed more support, and that I had always been the strong one, the one who did not need help, and that they had perhaps taken that strength for granted in ways they had not fully considered. I told her that being treated as though I did not need help was not the same as not needing help, and that 20 years of being the child who did not need anything had cost me things. Financial ones, specifically, but not only financial ones, that I was only now allowing myself to add up. My parents contributed an additional $12,000 to my wedding after that conversation, which I accepted, though I want to be honest that the acceptance felt complicated rather than fully resolving. Update 4 months later. My wedding happened 3 months ago. It was smaller than Emily's, 60 guests rather than 140, by my own choice rather than budget constraint, because I had decided, once the additional funding was available, that I wanted something more intimate regardless of what my parents were now willing to spend. My mother cried during the ceremony in a way that I chose to receive generously, though I noticed she cried during Emily's ceremony too. And I am aware that both sets of tears can be genuine while the underlying pattern of the 2 decades remains what it was. My parents have been, since the kitchen table conversation, noticeably more careful about equal treatment in smaller ways. A birthday gift for me that matched, for the first time in memory, the value of what they had given Emily for hers. An offer to help with a down payment on a house that came without my having to raise the comparison to Emily's earlier assistance with hers. I do not know if this represents a genuine shift in how they see me, or simply a more careful management of appearances, now that I have demonstrated I am paying attention. My therapist has suggested that both things can be true simultaneously, and that I do not need to resolve which one it is in order to accept the more equal treatment while it is happening. I am trying to accept that. It is a work in progress. Rachel spent 2 decades not naming the pattern, until an $800 offer forced her to see it. And just like Rachel discovered her parents' favoritism through money, the man in story 2 discovered his parents' favoritism through something that mattered even more. Attention. Specifically the attention his parents gave during the worst week of his life, compared to what they gave his brother during an ordinary week. Can you imagine being hospitalized and still coming second? This is the part that stays with me. Here is what happened. My name is Marcus. I am 29 years old. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and 14 months ago I was hospitalized for 6 days following a serious car accident that required surgery and a period of monitoring. And during that 6-day hospitalization, my parents visited once, for approximately 90 minutes, on the 2nd day. During that same week, they drove 6 hours round trip to attend my younger brother's regional basketball tournament game. A game that was not a championship or a particularly significant milestone in his athletic career. Simply a regular season game in a tournament that had several other games he played that same weekend that they did not attend. My brother's name is Tyler. He is 25 and has played competitive basketball since high school. A pursuit my parents have supported enthusiastically throughout his life in ways that have included attending the significant majority of his games, purchasing expensive equipment and training, and organizing family schedules around his athletic commitments. I want to be clear that I do not resent Tyler's athletic pursuits or my parents' support of them in the abstract. What I sat with, during 6 days in a hospital bed with significant pain, and the specific fear that comes with major surgery, was the accumulating awareness that my parents had made a choice, in real time, during a week when both of their children needed something from them, and had chosen Tyler's regular season basketball game over their son's hospitalization following a serious accident. I found out about the 6-hour drive to Tyler's game because my mother mentioned it during her single 90-minute visit, describing the game and Tyler's performance in some detail, apparently not registering the specific weight of describing an optional 6-hour round trip to her son, who was lying in a hospital bed that they had visited for less time than the drive itself had taken. I did not say anything during the visit. I want to explain why, because I think the why matters to understanding the eventual confrontation. I was, during that visit, still processing the accident itself, still managing significant pain, and not in a position to have the kind of clear conversation the situation deserved. I filed the information away. The way I had filed away, without fully examining, a pattern that had existed for most of my adult life. I confronted my parents about it 3 months after my hospitalization, once I had recovered and had time to think clearly about what I wanted to say. I called them together, on a video call, specifically so I could see both of their faces and have the conversation as a family rather than in a way that would allow one of them to relay a filtered version to the other afterward. I told them, factually, what I had observed. That during my 6-day hospitalization, they had visited once for 90 minutes, and had used part of that same week to drive 6 hours round trip for a regular season game of Tyler's. I asked them to help me understand the decision-making that had produced that outcome. That my father's response was that hospitals had visiting restrictions, and that they had not wanted to overwhelm me with too many visitors. I asked whether the restriction had prevented additional visits, or whether they had simply chosen not to make them. Given that Tyler's game had required a 6-hour round trip that same week while additional hospital visits would have required, at most, a 20-minute drive from their house. He did not have an answer for that distinction. My mother said that Tyler had been counting on them to be there, framing his basketball game, which he played in front of, I later confirmed, approximately 30 spectators including his own girlfriend's family, as an obligation of a magnitude that outweighed additional visits to their hospitalized son. I told my mother that I had also been counting on them, in a hospital bed, recovering from surgery, and that the counting on them in my situation seemed to have registered as less urgent than Tyler's basketball schedule. Neither of them had a satisfying answer, and the conversation ended without resolution. My mother crying and my father saying he thought I was overreacting to a busy week that had simply worked out the way it worked out. Update: 4 months later. My relationship with my parents has been notably strained in the 4 months since that call. I have not cut off contact entirely, but I have significantly reduced the frequency and the emotional investment I bring to our interactions, a distancing that my mother has noticed and commented on without, as far as I can tell, connecting it clearly to the hospitalization conversation. Tyler, when he found out about the confrontation through our mother, reached out to me directly, which I had not expected. He told me he had not known the full extent of the accident's severity at the time. Our parents had apparently minimized it when discussing it with him during that week, describing it in terms that made it sound less serious than 6 days of hospitalization and surgery actually was, and that he felt genuinely uncomfortable learning the full picture now. Tyler and I have had several honest conversations since then about the pattern more broadly, conversations I had not expected to have with him specifically, and he has told me that he has begun to notice, now that he is looking for it, ways in which the family's attention has organized around his activities more than mine throughout our childhood, something he said he had never had reason to examine until I forced the comparison into visibility. He has started, in small ways, redirecting some of our parents' attention, mentioning my accomplishments in conversations, asking them directly why they had not visited more during my hospitalization when he learned the details. I did not ask him to do this. I am grateful that he has, and I am also aware that his willingness to do it does not undo 25 years of an established pattern. But it is, I think, a genuine and meaningful shift from someone who has more standing within the family to name the pattern than I currently do. given how the hospitalization conversation was received. Marcus came second to a regular season basketball game while recovering from surgery, and just like Marcus, discovered the pattern through a single week of comparison. The woman in story 3 discovered her family's favoritism through something that took much longer to fully see: a will read after both her parents had passed away that confirmed in writing something she had suspected her entire life, but had never had proof of until the lawyer opened the envelope. Let that sink in. Here is what the will said. My name is Jennifer. I am 46 years old. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and 10 months ago, at the reading of my parents' will following my father's death 8 months after my mother's, I discovered financial records included as part of the estate documentation that revealed my parents had been providing my older brother with substantial financial support for over 20 years, totaling an amount the estate attorney calculated at approximately $340,000. During the same period, they had repeatedly told me they had no money to spare when I had asked for help during genuinely difficult periods of my own adult life. My brother's name is Stephen. He is 50 years old and has had, across his adult life, a pattern of financial instability that I had always understood, based on what my parents told me, as occasional and modest assistance during hard times, the kind of help most parents provide adult children now and then. What the estate documentation revealed was not occasional and modest. It was systematic and substantial. A down payment on Stephen's first house, 22 years ago, that my parents had told me at the time they could not help me with when I asked about assistance with my own first home purchase 2 years later. Monthly transfers to Stephen, beginning 15 years ago and continuing until my mother's death, that the estate attorney's records showed averaged $1,400 per month for the final decade. Money that had apparently been covering a significant portion of Stephen's living expenses during a period when he had told the family he was building a consulting business that never, as far as I could determine, generated meaningful income. Tuition payments for Stephen's 2 children, my niece and nephew, at a private school, spanning 12 years. During the same period, my parents told me they were not in a position to help with my own children's extracurricular activities when I had asked, modestly, for occasional assistance with expenses I could not fully cover on my own. I want to describe what it was like to sit in an attorney's office and see 20 years of documented transfers to my brother laid out in black and white, alongside my own memory of specific conversations in which my parents had told me they simply did not have the resources to help me during periods when I had genuinely struggled. A difficult divorce 8 years ago, a period of unemployment 11 years ago, the private school question for my own children. Each individual conversation, at the time, had seemed like a reasonable explanation from parents managing a fixed retirement income. Collectively, set against $340,000 in documented support to Stephen over the same period, the explanations were revealed as something else entirely. I confronted Stephen about this 2 weeks after the will reading. His response was that he had not known the full extent of what our parents were telling me, or not telling me, and that from his perspective, he had simply been receiving help during what he had genuinely believed was an ongoing, difficult period in his life that he had not fully explained to the rest of the family, because he was embarrassed about the consulting business's lack of success. I want to be fair to Stephen here. I do believe him when he says he did not orchestrate a deliberate deception of me specifically. What he did do, across 20 years, was accept substantial ongoing support without, as far as I can determine, ever asking our parents whether the same support was being offered to me, or advocating on my behalf when he presumably knew, at some level, that I was also an adult child of the same parents who might have benefited from similar assistance during my own difficult periods. I did contest the will, though I want to clarify what that meant in practice. I did not attempt to overturn the entire distribution, which split the remaining estate evenly between Stephen and me on paper. I pursued, through my attorney, a formal accounting of the pre-death transfers as advances against inheritance, a legal mechanism that, when successfully argued, resulted in a portion of Stephen's remaining inheritance being reduced to account for the $340,000 he had already received during our parents' lifetimes. so that the total lifetime distribution between us was more genuinely equal rather than only the remaining estate being split evenly while ignoring 2 decades of unequal prior support. This was not a simple or quick legal process. It took 7 months and required forensic accounting of records going back 2 decades. Stephen contested my contestation, arguing that gifts made during our parents' lifetime should not factor into the estate distribution. The court ultimately sided partially with my position, adjusting the final distribution to account for a portion, though not all, of the documented prior transfers. Update. 4 months later. Stephen and I have not spoken directly since the legal proceedings concluded 3 months ago, communicating only through our respective attorneys during the final stages of the estate settlement. I want to be honest that I do not know if our relationship will recover from this, and I am uncertain how I feel about that uncertainty. There are days I mourn the relationship we had before the will reading, built as it was on incomplete information, and days I recognize that the relationship I mourned was, in some sense, not fully real, constructed as it was on my not knowing what I now know. My own 2 children, both in their 20s now, have been supportive throughout this process in a way that has surprised me with its intensity. My daughter told me, during one difficult evening, that she had always sensed something was different about how Grandma and Grandpa treated Uncle Stephen's family versus ours. Small things she had noticed as a child that she had never had language for until I explained the fuller picture the will revealed, that I have used a portion of the adjusted inheritance to establish a modest education fund for my own grandchildren. A decision that felt important to me specifically because it represented the kind of support I wished had been available to my own children without my having to fight a legal battle to access what should have been equally available all along. Jennifer found 20 years of favoritism, documented in black and white, only after both parents had passed, and just like Jennifer's parents, managed the appearance of equal treatment, while quietly funding one child for decades. The woman in Story 4 discovered something her parents had been managing even more carefully, not with money, with a story they had told her entire childhood, about why her sister got everything, and she got nothing. A story that turned out to be completely false. Wait, this is the part that gets me most. In tonight's 5 stories, here is what she found out. My name is Amanda. I am 38 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, and 12 months ago I learned, through a conversation with my aunt during a family gathering, that the explanation my parents had given me my entire childhood for why my younger sister received preferential treatment, more attention, more resources, more forgiveness for the same behaviors that earned me punishment, was completely fabricated and had never been true. My sister's name is Katie. She is 35, and throughout our childhood, my parents had explained the differential treatment between us using a specific narrative. That Katie had been a difficult, high-risk pregnancy and birth, that she had spent her first weeks of life in a neonatal intensive care unit with a heart condition that had required ongoing monitoring throughout her childhood, and that this early medical fragility had shaped how our parents approached her upbringing, making them more protective, more indulgent, and more careful not to add stress to a child they had genuinely feared losing as an infant. I had grown up accepting this explanation. It was not a comfortable explanation. I still, as a child, felt the sting of watching Katie receive things I did not. Forgiveness I was not granted for equivalent behavior. Attention that flowed toward her almost automatically. But it was an explanation that made a kind of sense, that gave the unequal treatment a foundation I could understand even if I could not fully make peace with it. I had believed for 38 years that my sister had nearly died as an infant, and that our parents' subsequent treatment of her, while painful for me to experience, came from a place of genuine and understandable fear. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, a woman I have always been close to and who has no particular reason to fabricate anything at this point in her life, mentioned, during an unrelated conversation about family medical history, that she had always found it strange that our parents described Katie's birth as high risk, because she had been present for Katie's birth and remembered it as entirely unremarkable, a healthy full-term delivery with no complications, no NICU stay, no heart condition. I want to describe what happened in my body when my aunt said this, because it was a physical sensation before it was a cognitive one. A kind of vertigo. A sense that the ground I had built 38 years of understanding on was not where I had believed it to be. I asked my aunt to repeat what she had said. She did, with growing concern as she registered my reaction, and she asked whether I had not known this. I told her I had believed, my entire life, the opposite of what she was describing. My aunt confirmed, and offered to help me verify, that Katie's birth and infancy had been unremarkable. She had been present, she remembered clearly, and she was confident there had been no NICU stay, no heart condition, no medical fragility of the kind our parents had described to me for decades. I requested Katie's birth records, which are accessible to immediate family in Oregon under certain circumstances, and confirmed what my aunt had told me. A healthy, full-term, uncomplicated birth, no NICU admission, no cardiac diagnosis on any subsequent pediatric records I was able to access. The entire foundation of the explanation I had built my understanding of my childhood on was fabricated. I confronted my parents 6 weeks after learning this. Once I had gathered the documentation and given myself time to process the initial shock, I brought the birth records to a conversation with both of them present. I asked them to explain the discrepancy between what they had told me my entire childhood and what the actual medical records showed. My mother, after a long silence, said that the story had started small, an exaggeration of a mildly difficult labor that had grown, over years of repetition, into the fuller narrative I had grown up believing, and that at some point it had simply become easier to maintain the established story than to explain why they had preferred Katie without a justifying explanation. I asked my father directly whether he was saying that they had simply favored Katie, without any underlying medical reason, and had constructed an elaborate false narrative across my entire childhood specifically to give the unequal treatment a palatable explanation, rather than either treating us equally or admitting they did not treat us equally. He did not deny this characterization. My mother added, quietly, that Katie had simply been an easier child temperamentally, more compliant, less prone to the kind of assertiveness and pushback that I had displayed even as a young child, and that they had, over years, gravitated toward the child who required less management, dressing this preference up, eventually, in a medical narrative that made it feel less like favoritism and more like appropriate care for a fragile child. Update 4 months later. I told Katie about the fabricated medical narrative 3 months ago, a conversation I had genuinely not known how to approach given that she had also grown up believing, presumably, some version of her own medical fragility as an infant. I did not know, going into the conversation, whether Katie herself believed the story, or whether she had simply benefited from the differential treatment, without knowing the justification our parents were providing me for it. Katie's reaction surprised me. She told me she had never actually been told the NICU story directly. She had grown up simply receiving more indulgent treatment, without a specific narrative attached to it from her own perspective, and she had over the years developed her own vague assumption that she had simply been the easier, more likable child, an assumption she told me she had felt some quiet guilt about without ever fully articulating why. Learning that our parents had constructed an entire false medical narrative to justify their preference to me specifically, while apparently never directly telling Katie the same story, added a new and uncomfortable dimension to both of our understanding of our parents. Katie and I have grown notably closer in the months since this conversation, united in a shared reassessment of a family narrative we had each experienced from different, previously unexamined angles. Our relationship with our parents remains difficult and unresolved. My mother has apologized in general terms for the fabrication, though she has not offered a satisfying explanation for why a false medical narrative felt necessary or preferable to simply acknowledging an ordinary, if painful, parental preference. I am in therapy processing what it means to have built 38 years of self-understanding partly on a foundation I now know was constructed specifically to manage my perception of unequal treatment rather than address the treatment itself. Amanda's parents invented an entire medical crisis to explain a preference that had no real reason behind it at all. Our final story tonight, Story 5, is about a different kind of confrontation, because this time, the favored child is the one who finally said something, not the one who lost out, the one who won her entire life and finally could not carry the weight of it anymore. This is the last story, and it might be the one that surprises you most tonight. Here is what happened. My name is Elizabeth. I am 33 years old. I live in Seattle, Washington, and 6 months ago I told my parents, directly and deliberately, that I no longer wanted to be treated as their favorite child, and that I needed them to begin extending to my older brother the same warmth, attention, and generosity they had extended to me for as long as I could remember. My brother's name is David. He is 37, and I want to tell this story from a specific angle that I think is less commonly discussed. The perspective of the favored child who eventually could not continue benefiting from a pattern that was actively harming her sibling. I had known, for most of my adult life, that my parents treated David and me differently. I had absorbed this knowledge the way favored children often do, I think, with a kind of guilty awareness that did not translate into action for many years, because acknowledging the pattern clearly would have required me to examine my own comfortable position within it. And because David and I had never been especially close as adults, a distance that I now understand was itself partly a product of the favoritism, making genuine solidarity between us more difficult than it should have been. The specific accumulation that led to my confrontation happened over roughly 15 years of family events that I began, in the final years before I said something, to actually watch rather than simply move through. About their pride in my accomplishments. At David's graduation 2 years earlier, they had attended the ceremony itself, but had not organized any celebration afterward, citing scheduling conflicts that I later learned had not actually existed. At my wedding 4 years ago, my parents had been enthusiastically involved in every aspect of planning, had paid for significant portions of it, and had given toasts that lasted several minutes each about what I meant to them. At David's wedding 2 years before mine, they had attended, contributed a modest gift, and as far as I could determine from asking his wife afterward, had not offered to give a toast at all, a silence that his wife told me had been noticeably strange, and had hurt David more than he had ever directly told me. I want to describe the specific moment that finally moved me to say something, because it was smaller than any of these larger examples and, I think, more revealing because of its smallness. At a family barbecue 8 months ago, David mentioned, in a completely ordinary tone without any apparent self-pity, that he had gotten a promotion at work the previous week. My mother said that was nice, dear, and immediately turned to ask me about a work project I had mentioned weeks earlier, spending the next 15 minutes asking me detailed follow-up questions about my project while David's promotion, a genuinely significant professional achievement, received no further acknowledgement from either parent for the rest of the afternoon. I watched David's face during those 15 minutes. I watched him absorb in real time the specific and familiar experience of being deprioritized in favor of me. Something I understood, watching it happen with fresh clarity, he had been absorbing for essentially his entire adult life. I called my parents 2 weeks after that barbecue and asked to meet with them privately. I told them, as directly as I could manage, that I had spent 15 years watching them favor me over David in ways that were consistent, obvious, and I believed deeply damaging to him, and that I needed them to understand I did not want the position they had given me. I told them about the barbecue specifically, About the promotion that received 30 seconds of acknowledgement set against 15 minutes of interest in my comparatively minor work update. I told them about the wedding toasts, the graduation celebrations, the pattern I had finally allowed myself to actually see rather than simply benefit from. My father's initial response was defensive, suggesting that David and I simply had different relationships with them, and that this was normal for families. I told him that different relationships did not typically produce a 15-minute versus 30-second disparity in response to comparable news, and that I needed him to sit with the specificity of what I was describing rather than generalizing it into an abstraction about normal family variation. My mother, to her credit, did not immediately defend herself. She was quiet for a long time, and then said she thought I might be right, and that she did not know why it had happened, but that she had never intended for David to feel the way I was describing him feeling. Update. 4 months later, my parents have made visible, if imperfect, efforts in the months since that conversation. They organized a dinner for David's most recent work anniversary, something they had never previously done for a professional milestone of his. My mother has told me, in a few candid moments, that she is trying to catch herself in real time when she notices herself gravitating toward asking me about my life rather than David's, and that the catching is harder than she expected, suggesting the pattern was deeper and more automatic than either of us had fully appreciated before I named it. David and I have grown significantly closer since I raised this with our parents. I told him directly, about a month after my initial conversation with them, that I had noticed the pattern and had said something about it. A conversation that he received, he told me, with a complicated mixture of vindication and grief. Vindication that someone had finally named what he had spent decades absorbing silently, and grief for the years the naming had not happened. We have started having monthly dinners, just the two of us, something we had never done before in our adult lives, building a relationship between siblings that I think the favoritism itself had quietly prevented from forming naturally. I do not know if my parents' efforts represent a permanent shift or a temporary correction that will fade once the discomfort of my confrontation recedes. I am watching, the way I finally learned to watch at that barbecue 8 months ago, and I am telling David what I see.